40,000 soldiers marched into this valley. Only a handful lived to tell what happened next. This is Albulena, the place where one general turned certain defeat into eternal legend.
For 3 months, 8,000 warriors vanished into these mountains. The Empire thought it had won. And when they struck from the darkness, they made the sound of 100,000 men. Pure chaos.
This is the story of Skanderbeg, the man who taught giants to fear the shadows.
In the summer of 1457, in the mountains of Albania, 40,000 Ottoman soldiers marched with the absolute certainty that they would crush the resistance of a small principality. Their commanders knew every tactic, every stratagem, every trick of the enemy. And for a simple reason, one of them was the Albanian leader's own nephew, a traitor who had sold his family in exchange for a promised throne. But what awaited them was not an army in flight. It was not surrender. It was silence. For 3 months, the land seemed to swallow the Albanians. No trace, no sign. Only rumors that the great Skanderbeg had finally been defeated. The Ottomans celebrated before the victory, and then, on a September dawn, the mountain awakened. Screams erupted from the darkness. Torches lit up on the hills like stars falling over the camp. The clang of metal against metal echoed through the valley. Albanians descended from the slopes in furious waves, striking, cutting, destroying. Tents collapsed in flames, horses galloped aimlessly, men awakened from sleep ran without knowing where to flee. In the midst of the chaos, a cry pierced the fog. Skanderbeg arrived. When the sun rose over Albulena, one of the greatest armies of Ottoman Christendom lay in ruins, and the traitor who had promised to deliver his homeland was dragged in chains before the man he called uncle. The most brilliant ambush in European medieval history had been executed, and the echo of that morning would traverse centuries. To understand what happened in that valley, one must first understand the world that surrounded small Albania in the mid-15th century. The Ottoman Empire was at the height of its expansion. Just 4 years earlier, in 1453, Constantinople had fallen under the command of the young Sultan Mehmed II, the Conqueror, the millennial capital of the Byzantine Empire. The city that for centuries had served as a shield between the East and the West now displayed the crescent flag. For Christian Europa, it was an earthquake. Kings, popes, and nobles awoke to a terrible reality. Islam was advancing, and no one seemed capable of stopping it. In the Balkans, nation after nation bowed before Ottoman power. Serbia had fallen. Bosnia trembled. Gracia was already a memory. Only a few pockets of resistance still burned in the mountains, and among them, the fiercest was hidden among the peaks and valleys of Albania. There, a man had led the resistance for over a decade. His name was Gjergj Kastrioti, but the world knew him by another title. Skanderbeg, Lord Alexander, a reference to the great Macedonian conqueror. And the irony of his story was that he himself had been shaped by the Ottomans to destroy Christians. Skanderbeg was born around 1405, son of an Albanian lord who tried to survive among greater powers. As a boy, he was sent as a hostage to the Ottoman court, a common practice to ensure the loyalty of conquered vassals. In Edirne, he was converted to Islam, received an elite military education, and quickly demonstrated exceptional talent for war. The Ottomans trained him, promoted him, and admired him. He commanded Turkish troops against Serbs, Hungarians, and Greeks. He became a respected general under Sultan Murad II. But in 1443, during the Battle of Niš, when the Hungarians inflicted a defeat on the Ottomans, Skanderbeg saw his opportunity. He deserted with 300 Albanians under his command, returned to his homeland, reconverted to Christianity, and took the fortress of Kruja using a forged letter with the Sultan's seal. From that moment on, he never stopped fighting. In March 1444, he gathered the Albanian lords in the Liga de Leja, a military alliance that united historically rival clans under a single banner, the double-headed eagle. During the next 25 years, Skanderbeg would face the Ottomans in more than 30 battles, using guerrilla tactics, mountain ambushes, and an intimate knowledge of the terrain that transformed every valley into a trap. He became a nightmare for the sultans. Murad II tried to crush him and failed. Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, swore to destroy him. None succeeded. But resistance had its costs. In 1455, Skanderbeg suffered a devastating defeat in the siege of Berat. The responsible Ottoman commander was Ishak Bey Evrenos, an experienced general who knew Albanian tactics well. The disaster shook the morale of the troops, and worse still, began to open fissures in the loyalty of some officers. One of them was Moisi Arianit Golemi, who deserted to the Ottomans, although he later returned defeated. But the deepest wound was yet to come, and it would come from the blood of Skanderbeg's own family. Hamza Castrioti was Skanderbeg's nephew, son of his brother Stanisha. After his father's death, Hamza was raised by his uncle as a son. He fought alongside him since 1443, when both deserted from the Ottoman army. For over a decade, he was one of Skanderbeg's most trusted officers, commanding cavalry in crucial battles like Oranik. But something changed in 1456. That year, Skanderbeg had a son, Gjon Castrioti II, who would become his legitimate heir. For Hamza, who until then was the uncle's probable successor, it was a devastating blow. Years of loyalty seemed to evaporate before the prospect of being passed over. Emissaries of Sultan Mehmed II approached Hamza with seductive promises. If he betrayed Skanderbeg and helped conquer Albania, he would receive control of the country as a vassal of the empire. For a man consumed by frustrated ambition, the offer was irresistible. In early 1457, Hamza Castrioti abandoned his uncle, crossed enemy lines, and swore loyalty to the Sultan. He took with him not only some discontented nobles, but something much more valuable: complete knowledge of all tactics, routes, hiding places, and strategies that Skanderbeg had used for 13 years. The betrayal hurt more than any defeat in battle. Skanderbeg had raised that boy, trained that soldier, trusted that commander. Now Hamza would march against him at the head of an Ottoman army, promising to deliver his head to the Sultan. The wound was personal, intimate, impossible to ignore. But Skanderbeg was not a man to surrender to despair. If his nephew knew all his old tactics, then he would need to invent a new one. At the end of May 1457, the Ottoman army crossed the Albanian border. Estimates vary, but historians calculate between 40 and 80,000 men. Sipahi cavalry, regular infantry, archers, Akinci horsemen for reconnaissance and pillaging. At the forefront marched two commanders, Ishak Bey Evrenos, the veteran who had defeated Skanderbeg in Berat 2 years earlier, and Hamza Castrioti, the traitorous nephew who had promised to guide the invaders to victory. The combination was devastating. Two men who intimately knew the Albanian mountains, the guerrilla tactics, the hiding places in the forests. There would be no surprises this time. There would be no ambushes. Skanderbeg was, finally, cornered. Or so the Ottomans thought. Skanderbeg gathered his army. He had between 8,000 and 10,000 men, perhaps a fifth of the invading force's size. Peasants with spears, archers with hunting bows, light cavalry accustomed to attacking and disappearing. Against them came the most powerful war machine in the known world. Military logic said that resistance was suicide. But Skanderbeg did not intend to fight the way his enemies expected. If Hamza knew all his old tactics, then he would do something no one had ever attempted. He would make his army disappear. The orders were precise and absolute. Skanderbeg divided his forces into small groups, some with only a few dozen men. Each unit received instructions to march in different directions, hide in the mountains, avoid any contact with the Ottomans, and wait. There would be no guerrilla attacks. There would be no ambushes in the passes. There would not even be smoke signals or campfires. The Albanians simply vanished, like ghosts, as if the earth itself had swallowed them. The Ottomans advanced through the Mat River Valley, burning villages, plundering granaries, searching for the enemy. But they found no one. Week after week, their scouts returned empty-handed. The villagers had fled. The fields were abandoned. The fortresses remained silent. Ishak Bey sent patrols to Shkoder. In the north, nothing. Hamza scoured every mountain he knew from childhood. Nothing. Where was Skanderbeg? Where had his army fled? Rumors began to spread. The Venetians in Duris, who had their own conflicts with Skanderbeg, fueled the narrative. The great Albanian leader had finally been defeated. His men had abandoned him. He had fled to the mountains to save his own life. The Venetian captain Marco Diedo wrote to the Doge in July. The great Skanderbeg fled to the mountains to save his head, and everyone abandoned him. The news spread across Europa. Some lamented. Others sighed with relief. The Albanian resistance, it seemed, had come to an end. Ishak Bey and Hamza believed it. After 3 months of marching without encountering significant opposition, after devastating the Mat Valley without any counterattack, the Ottoman commanders concluded that the campaign was essentially won. Skanderbeg was a finished man. His army had dispersed. There was no longer any reason to continue spending resources in that arid land. At the end of August, preparations for withdrawal began. The army camped in the fields of Albulena, also known as Ujabarda, in north of Mount Tumanishta. They fortified the northern side of the camp, from where they expected possible attacks. The eastern side, facing the dense forests, was left less protected. After all, there was no enemy to attack them. But in the mountains, thousands of eyes watched. Throughout the summer, while the Ottomans celebrated their anticipated victory, the Albanians remained hidden. Fed by loyal villagers who never revealed their whereabouts, sheltered in caves and remote valleys, they waited. Skanderbeg had not fled. He was studying, observing, calculating, waiting for the exact moment when the arrogance of his enemies would become their greatest weakness. When he learned that the Ottomans were preparing to withdraw, when he learned that the camp in Albolena was relaxed and poorly defended on the eastern flank, Skanderbeg sent the signal. One by one, the dispersed groups began to move. Silently, through trails known only by the mountaineers, thousands of Albanian soldiers converged on the hills of Tumanishta. There were no campfires, there were no drums. There was no sign that could alert the Ottomans. On the night of September 1st, while the enemy camp slept under the illusion of security, 8,000 Albanians gathered on the slopes above them. Skanderbeg personally climbed a high peak to observe the enemy camp. What he saw confirmed his hopes. Tents, scattered without defensive order, unsaddled horses, sleepy sentinels, soldiers resting without armor. The army that was supposed to conquer Albania was completely vulnerable. Skanderbeg descended with a group of his best men to silently eliminate the guards. Darkness covered them. The plan was perfect. But then, a sentinel awoke. He saw shadows moving. He recognized the Albanian faces, and before he could be silenced, he ran towards the camp, shouting, "Skanderbeg arrived! Skanderbeg is here!" The element of surprise was partially lost. Any other commander would have hesitated, retreated, sought another opportunity. Skanderbeg did not. In seconds, he made the decision that would define the battle. If he could not attack in silence, he would attack with all the noise in the world. He ordered his men to beat swords against shields, tools against armor, anything that would produce sound. The goal was simple: to make 8,000 men sound like 80,000. To make chaos seem like an apocalypse. The dawn of September 2nd, 1457, exploded in fury. From 3 directions, the Albanians descended the hills like avalanches of steel. The din was deafening. War cries mixed with the clash of metal. Torches illuminated the darkness like lightning. The Ottomans awoke to the nightmare. Men leaped from their tents without armor, without weapons, without knowing where the attack was coming from. Panicked horses knocked down their own owners. Officers shouted orders that no one could hear. The world's most disciplined military formation transformed into a chaotic mass of terrified men. Hamza Castrioti desperately tried to rally his troops. He ran among the tents, shouting that the Albanians were few, that the noise was a trick, that it was enough to form lines and counterattack. But no one listened to him. Panic had taken over. Ishak Bey tried to send reinforcements to the attack points, but he could not even determine where the Albanians were coming from. Every direction seemed to have enemies. Every shadow seemed to hide a blade. The Albanian cavalry tore through the camp from the eastern flank, exactly where the defenses were weakest. Behind them came the infantry, striking, cutting, setting fire. Tents collapsed in flames. Supply depots exploded. The campaign treasury, intended to pay the soldiers, was captured intact. The Ottoman standards, symbols of imperial pride, fell one after another into the blood-soaked mud. Skanderbeg personally led the central charge. His sword cut through the confusion as his men shouted his name like a war chant. For the Albanians, he was more than a commander. He was living proof that resistance was possible, that a small people could face the greatest empire on earth. And that morning, he showed why. The battle lasted hours, but the outcome was decided in the first minutes. The Ottomans never managed to reorganize. Every attempt to form lines was interrupted by new attacks from unexpected directions. The Albanians knew the terrain. The Ottomans did not. The Albanians fought for the survival of their homeland. The Ottomans fought only to escape alive. The difference was absolute. When the sun finally rose over the valley of Albulena, it revealed a scene of complete devastation. The battlefield was covered with bodies, broken armor, trampled standards. Horses wandered aimlessly among the burned tents. Ottoman survivors fled in all directions, pursued by Albanian knights who knew every escape route. Ishak Bey managed to escape, gathering a handful of men and disappearing to the south. But thousands of his soldiers were not so lucky. Estimates of casualties vary among historians. Some speak of 15,000 Ottoman dead, others reach 30,000 between dead and captured. 24 standards were taken as trophies. The entire camp treasury fell into Albanian hands. Gifts from the plunder were sent to the King of Naples, to the Pope in Roma, and to the King of España, notifying them of the victory. But the most important prisoner was not a general or any noble. Hamza Castrioti was captured alive. The traitorous nephew, the man who had sold his family for promises of power, was dragged in chains before Skanderbeg. The accounts do not describe what passed between the two at that moment. We do not know if there were words of anger, sadness, or silent contempt. We only know that Skanderbeg spared his life. Hamza was sent as a prisoner to Naples, where he was held in the custody of King Alfonso. Years later, he was released and left for Constantinople, where he lived the rest of his days serving the empire that had promised to give him Albania. He never again set foot in his homeland. The Battle of Albolena entered history as Skanderbeg's most brilliant victory. The historian of the Ottoman Empire, Franz Babinger, described it in exactly those terms, and the impact was immense. After that September morning, practically no officer deserted from the Albanian army anymore. The loyalty that had been shaken by previous betrayals was permanently restored. If Skanderbeg could defeat an army 5 times larger, led by men who knew all his tactics, then perhaps resistance was not as impossible as it seemed. For the Ottoman Empire, the defeat was a shock. Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, was forced to reconsider his Albanian strategy. In the following years, he would seek truces and negotiations, tacitly recognizing that crushing Skanderbeg would require resources that might not be worth spending. Albania would remain free as long as its leader lived. For Christian Europa, Albulena was a light in the darkness. At a time when the Ottoman advance seemed unstoppable, when kings and emperors bowed before the crescent, a small principality in the Balkans Mountains had proven that resistance was possible. Pope Calixto III had already named Skanderbeg Captain General of the Holy See. Now, his reputation as a champion of Christendom was cemented forever. Skanderbeg would continue fighting for 11 more years until his death from malaria in 1468. Without him, the Albanian resistance gradually disintegrated. Kruja fell in 1478. Albania would remain under Ottoman rule for the next 4 centuries. But the memory of Skanderbeg never died. More than 1,000 books have been written about him in over 20 languages. Composers like Vivaldi created operas in his honor. Generals studied his tactics in European military academies. In 1756, Major General James Wolfe of Gran Bretagna wrote that Skanderbeg exceeded all officers, ancient and modern, in the conduct of a small defensive army. In 2005, the Congreso dos Estados Unidos approved a resolution honoring the 600th anniversary of his birth. recognizing his role in saving Western Europa from Ottoman occupation. And in modern Albania, he remains the supreme national hero, his face stamped on coins and statues, his double-headed eagle adorning the country's flag. But perhaps the deepest legacy of Albulena is something simpler. It is proof that numbers do not decide battles. It is the demonstration that knowing the enemy's tactics does not guarantee victory if he is capable of inventing new ones. It is the eternal reminder that a united people, fighting for their land, can defeat even the greatest empire in the world. In that valley among the mountains of Albania, on a September dawn more than 5 centuries ago, 8,000 men faced 40,001. Not by brute force, not by numerical superiority, but by courage, strategy, and an iron will to remain free. Skanderbeg transformed his greatest weakness into his greatest weapon. He made his army disappear. He made his enemies believe they had won. And then, when arrogance blinded them, he attacked from the shadows and changed history. The wind still blows over Albulena. The mountains still hold the echoes of that battle. And somewhere among the stones and trees, the memory of Skanderbeg still lives. The boy who was raised to destroy Christians and became their greatest defender. The general who deserted an empire and built another from nothing. The man who proved, in a single bloody dawn, that even giants can fall when they face those who refuse to kneel.